They looked me in the eye, and threw my warning in the trash. I was a young naval intelligence officer when I uncovered the unthinkable intercepted messages pointing to an imminent Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. I reported it clear, urgent, undeniable. They silenced me, laughed, reassigned me. Days later, the sky over Hawaii exploded in fire and death. But that was only the beginning. What followed was a war not just on the battlefield, but against the truth itself. Government officials buried the evidence. They hunted me, tried to destroy the woman who helped me expose it. But we fought back with documents, recordings, and one devastating revelation that rocked the highest ranks of power. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's the story of how two ordinary voices shattered a wall of silence so that history could never lie again. Watch until the end, because the truth they tried to erase just became unforgettable. He threw my report in the trash. Just like that. A crisp, typewritten stack of warnings, days of intel interviews, and desperate signals discarded as if it were yesterday's gossip. And then, with a smug smile, Commander Hargrove said, "Lieutenant, we are not in the business of chasing ghosts." That was the moment I knew history was about to crack open, and no one in Washington would be ready for what poured out. I am Lieutenant David E. Mathers, Naval Intelligence. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be my break-my-climb from paper pusher to field man. I had been stationed at Station Hypo in Hawaii, an intelligence outpost often ignored by the suits in D.C. But I was there for one reason: to decode, to catch whispers in the static, and to protect lives. I wasn't some hero. I was a good listener. But nobody listens to the man with too much truth. It started 5 days before December 7th, 1941. I was hunched over a teletype transmission that came from our intercept station near Wake Island. At first glance it was routine, standard naval frequency scans. But there was something off. Buried in the code were repeated coordinates and silence where there should have been chatter. The kind of silence that screams. "Looks like they're clearing frequencies," I told Angela. Angela Kimura. Our civilian decoding specialist was the only one who took my hunches seriously. Her Japanese was fluent, her mind razor-sharp, but because she was a woman half Asian at that, her expertise was always labeled temporary. Her brow furrowed as she examined the intercepts. "David, this doesn't feel like maneuvers. These look like strike orders. Look at the phrasing. We brought it to Commander Hargrove. He didn't even look up. The Japanese Navy doesn't have the fuel range to hit us here. It's bluff." "It's not bluff," I said, heart thumping. "This formation, they're already in the Pacific. They've been radio silent for days. That's not protocol. That's war prep." He dismissed us. Angela's face turned crimson with frustration. I remember her gripping the edge of the desk knuckles white. "They're going to hit Pearl. I can feel it," she whispered later. "And no one will believe it until it's too late." December 6th. I stayed in the intel room overnight. Angela brought me coffee, and we pored over every line of Morse, every static-laced wave from the Pacific. I didn't sleep. My gut churned with dread. At Oro 300, a final intercept came through. Coordinates, orders, silence. I stood, walked to the command office, and typed the words, "Myself. Highly likely strike on Pearl Harbor within 24 hours. Request immediate alert." They laughed, and then the sky fell. December 7th, 1941. The morning was still. Still in that eerie, deceptive way. Blue skies, a gentle breeze, the sweet scent of plumeria in the air. I was eating a stale muffin when the first rumble came. Low, ominous. Angela burst into the office, her eyes wide. "David, look outside." I ran. Overhead, like metal wasps, the first Japanese Zero fighters cut through the clouds. Then the explosions began. I watched the USS Arizona erupt like a volcano iron, twisting fire-consuming sailors I'd briefed days earlier. Men jumped into burning water. Planes burned mid-air. Screams tore through paradise. I ran toward the harbor, dodging debris, desperate to help. I pulled Corporal Dennis Carr out of the flames near Dock 4. His uniform was torn, eyes, bloodshot, leg mangled. Why didn't they know, he whispered. Because no one listened. Angela and I stood together that night overlooking the harbor, which now looked like a floating graveyard. She held my trembling hand. "Did you keep the copy?" she asked. I nodded. In my duffel bag, hidden deep under my uniform shirts, was a carbon copy of the report. Time-stamped, dated, marked ignored. "Then you can still speak," she said. "Even if they won't listen now, history will." I didn't feel brave. I felt broken. But in that moment, as smoke still curled into the Hawaiian sky, I knew this was just the beginning. They thought they'd buried the warning, but I was still here. I had survived, and I would tell the truth, even if it cost me everything. You'd think, after watching fire rain from the sky and ships sink with men still screaming aboard, someone would have finally listened. A congressional inquiry, a military tribunal, even a quiet hallway whisper. Something, but instead, they came for me. It was barely a week after the attack when I was called into a debriefing room at Pearl Harbor Naval Headquarters. The war had barely begun, but the war on truth that had already started. I walked into the room with stiff shoulders and tired eyes. I hadn't slept much since December 7th. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sirens again, smelled the fuel burning, saw the eyes of the dying. There were 3 men in the room, all in starched uniforms, all with icy glares. But the man at the center chilled me to the bone. Rear Admiral Jonathan Carver, D.C. liaison, rumored to be more politician than soldier. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes were like mirrors reflecting nothing. He tapped a folder with his finger. "Lieutenant Mathers," he began without pleasantries. "We've reviewed your intelligence memos. Quite dramatic." "It wasn't fiction," I said, my voice barely hiding the anger. "You have the time-stamped intercepts. You know I warned. You submitted a preliminary analysis," he cut in. "Not actionable intelligence." Angela's voice rang in my memory. "They will rewrite the timeline and erase us from it." I looked at the 2 other officers, stone-faced. Not allies, witnesses, maybe even jailers. I submitted a threat report, I said, calm but firm. It was corroborated by 2 other analysts and supported by unusual enemy silence on major channels. It should have triggered a condition read. Carver leaned forward, folding his hands. "Do you have any idea what would have happened if we'd acted on your assumption mass panic? Grounded ships, suspended liberties, and, in the end, maybe nothing." "Nothing," I snapped. "Tell that to the families pulling charred tags from the wreckage of the Arizona." For a split second, his jaw clenched. A flicker of emotion or annoyance that I dared speak out. "You're young," he said, "and emotional. That's understandable. But we are trying to win a war now. The time for finger-pointing has passed." They reassigned me the next day. No more codes. no more field work. I was sent to a records office on Ford Island, a warehouse full of filing cabinets and supply manifests. They wanted me buried in paper, but I wasn't alone. Angela found me on the third day. She had the fire of someone with nothing left to lose. "They're going to bury the warnings," she said flatly. "Burn the paper trail. Promote the silence." I nodded. "They already started. I'm not sure how long I'll even be in uniform." Angela opened her satchel and pulled out something wrapped in brown cloth. She unrolled it slowly, a wire recorder. "I got the playback," she whispered, "from the wake intercepts." I copied the original reel. I wasn't supposed to, but something told me. My breath caught in my throat. "You still have the voice data." She nodded. "And the broadcast logs. If we release this, the world will know we knew. And someone ignored it." But how do you leak the truth during a war? Everyone wanted unity, silence, patriotism, not shame. We couldn't go to the press. They were muzzled by military censorship. We couldn't go to command. They already decided we were the problem. Angela whispered the impossible. "There's a congressman, Leo Rutherford, quiet, Republican from Oregon. Lost his brother on the Arizona. He might listen." We made the decision to travel in secret. Angela went first, said she'd send word through a bookstore contact in San Francisco if the meeting happened. I stayed behind, playing dumb, shuffling records like the obedient grunt they wanted me to be. Then, one night, I came back to my bunk and found my footlocker pried open. The carbon copy was gone. I stared at the gaping lock. My hands trembled with fury. Not fear, fury. They weren't just silencing warnings. They were destroying history. The next morning, a jeep arrived. Orders. I was being transferred again, this time to a transport vessel heading east. I knew the message disappear or be disappeared, but I had already made my decision. I went AWOL that night, changed clothes, cut my hair, burned my ID tags. With the help of a local fisherman, an old man named Keone, who had lost a grandson in the attack, I slipped off Oahu under cover of darkness. 3 weeks later, I arrived in Portland, Oregon. The country was covered in flags and recruitment posters, but under the surface, fear still swirled. Fear of spies, fear of traitors, fear of the truth. Angela met me at the train station. She looked different, harder, tired. "He listened," she said simply. She handed me an envelope. Inside were copies, the intercepted orders, her memo, my report, and a letter, written on congressional letterhead. "Lieutenant Mathers, I believe you. The country will too if we can find the courage." Signed, Leo Rutherford. For the first time since the attack, I felt something stir in my chest. Hope, but hope was dangerous. And as Angela and I would soon find out, the machine we were about to challenge wasn't just the Navy. It was the United States government. They say the enemy wears a different uniform, that when the threat comes you'll know it by the flag it doesn't fly. They were wrong, because the men hunting me, they wore stars and stripes. They saluted the same anthem. They drank coffee under portraits of Washington and Roosevelt, and they were more afraid of my voice than of the Empire of Japan. Angela and I lived like fugitives for the next month. Rutherford arranged for us to stay in a back room above a church in a quiet part of Portland. Reverend Dawson, a grizzled man of God with war wounds from the Great War, never asked too many questions. He just brought us stew and kept the lights low at night. "Tell the truth." "Son," he said to me once, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "But make sure you're alive long enough to finish the sentence." It was during those long, candlelit nights that we pieced together what would become the file. The one that could expose everything. Angela had cataloged the exact timeline of the intercepted orders. We matched it with internal dispatch logs from Pacific Fleet Command, which showed who received my report and when. Each signature, each denial, each stamp of non-critical. And then we found it. Buried in the clearance logs was a signature R. Carver, Rear Admiral Jonathan Carver. He hadn't just ignored the warning, he had blocked it. Rutherford called us to Washington. We went by train, slow, careful, changing names at every stop. Angela became Anna Chang, a war widow. I was Daniel Morgan, a railway inspector. No one looked twice. When we reached the capital, Rutherford greeted us himself. Not with a handshake, but a hug. He looked old, tired, but his voice carried the weight of purpose. "You're not the first whistleblower to come to me," he said as we walked under marble pillars. "But you may be the first who brings the Navy to its knees." His office was modest. Wood paneling. A dusty portrait of Lincoln. But when he opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out the black-bound petition for congressional hearing, the gravity hit me. "You ready to do this publicly?" he asked. Angela's eyes locked on mine. For the first time in weeks, I saw something flicker there. Not fear. Conviction. "Yes," she said. "We've been ready since they let our people burn." 3 days later, the subpoena reached the Pentagon, and hell broke loose. The Navy launched an internal review overnight. A press statement declared our accusations as misguided, emotionally driven, and unsubstantiated. Carver called it a grieving young man's attempt to find purpose in tragedy. I got a letter that same week from my old superior Hargrove. It wasn't apology. It was threat. "Lieutenant, for your own sake, and the morale of the nation during wartime, I urge you to cease all public declarations regarding December 7th. The consequences could be irrevocable." Angela ripped it in half without a word. Then the smear campaign began. Articles appeared in the Washington Post and New York Times questioning my record. An anonymous source claimed I'd suffered mental distress prior to the attack. One called Angela a civilian, overstepping her boundaries. The headlines stung, but the worst part, they were working. The public, still grieving, clung to heroes, not heretics. We were turning into the villains of our own truth. I stood outside the Capitol steps one morning, watching a crowd pass by. A father hoisted his son on his shoulders, a boy in a sailor's cap, proud, smiling, and I felt the weight of it all. What if they were right? What if telling this story did nothing but tear the nation further? Angela joined me on the steps holding 2 coffee cups. She pressed one into my hand. Her gaze never wavered. "If they get away with this," she said softly, "it won't just be Pearl Harbor. It'll be the next city, the next surprise. And the next time, you won't even be there to try to stop it." I nodded. "I'm scared," I admitted. "So am I," she said. "But I'm still standing." On March 3, 1942, the hearing began. I wore my uniform, polished to a mirror shine. Angela wore her father's war medal on her blouse. Rutherford introduced us before a sea of senators, reporters, and military brass. Cameras flashed. The gallery was packed. I took a breath and began to speak. I told them everything. The intercepts, the silence, the report. The moment Carver looked me in the eye and chose image over lives. I handed them the files, the logs, Angela's real recording, and the letter from Hargrove. Each word was fire, and I watched it burn through the lies. When I finished, the room was silent, but not in disbelief, in shock. Even Senator Vandenberg, staunch military loyalist, was pale. Angela stepped up next. She didn't shake. She didn't stutter. She played the tape. The room filled with static, then a voice in Japanese. Calm, commanding. Translating in real time, she said. Target Pearl Harbor. Time of impact dawn. Proceed under radio silence. Await final signal. When it ended, no one moved, until Rutherford leaned into the mic and said, "Let the record show that the truth has found daylight. But daylight is dangerous in the shadows of power." That night, Angela and I were followed. Men in suits, unmarked cars, and then came the anonymous note, shoved under our hotel door. Stop, or she disappears next. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Angela shook me awake. "David," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "There's someone outside." Third night in a row. I sprang up, heart racing. I crept to the window of the small D.C. motel room we had taken under assumed names Mr. and Mrs. Walters this time. From behind the curtains, I saw them again. A dark sedan. Headlights off. Same car as last night. The same car that followed Angela to the post office. That lingered too long when we entered the Congressional Building. Always parked, never confronting. But always there. "They're watching," I said. "They're telling us they can reach us whenever they want." Angela didn't flinch. She just exhaled. "Then we tell them we're not afraid." But she didn't sleep again that night. Neither did I. 2 days later, the sabotage began. First, it was Rutherford's staff assistant arrested on falsified charges of leaking classified information. They seized his office, shut down his typewriters, and revoked his security clearance. Then came the newspaper hit piece, "Disgraced Officer and Civilian Woman." "Fabricate Pearl Harbor, Conspiracy for Personal Gain," screamed the headline in the New York Standard. It used a grainy photo of Angela with her eyes half blinked and mine mid-sentence unflattering, deceptive, damaging. The article hinted at improper relationship mental instability and possible enemy sympathy. Angela threw the paper across the room. "They're not even trying to hide the smear campaign anymore." "They don't have to," I replied. "They know the machine's on their side." But it got worse. On March 10th, we returned to the motel after a brief secure meeting with Congressman Rutherford. The door was ajar. Angela froze. "David." I raised a hand and stepped inside slowly. The room had been torn apart. Drawers pulled out, clothes shredded, bed sheets slashed. But it wasn't theft, it was a message. The file we had compiled, the one with the evidence, gone. Only one thing remained, a note on the mirror written in red lipstick. "You were warned." Angela's face crumpled, not in fear, but fury. "They think fear will erase the truth." I clenched my fists. Then we write it again. From memory. We found sanctuary with Rutherford's cousin in Baltimore, an old school teacher named Miss Eunice, who had a locked cellar and no love for the Navy since her brother died in a submarine accident they tried to cover up. It was there, under dim yellow light, and with trembling fingers that we rebuilt the file. Word for word, line by line. Angela remembered the intercepts by heart. I redrafted the timeline. We matched it to every document Rutherford still had. And we did something else. We made copies, 6 of them, and we mailed them secretly to trusted journalists, war widows, and one to a certain retired judge in Chicago known for standing up to federal pressure. "If anything happens to us," Angela said, sealing the last envelope, "the truth won't die." But they weren't done trying. Angela was hit by a car 4 days later. We had just left the courthouse after a closed-door meeting with the Special Commission. I was distracted, arguing with a young aide. Angela stepped off the curb, and I heard the screech. The black coupe never stopped. It slammed into her and sped off. She hit the pavement hard, skidding across the sidewalk, her head slamming against a hydrant. Blood poured. I screamed. Angela. She survived. A fractured rib. Concussion. Dislocated shoulder. But she survived. The hospital kept her for 5 days. I slept in a chair by her bed. When she finally opened her eyes, bruised and groggy, she smiled crookedly. "You look like hell, Lieutenant." I burst out laughing, then crying. I didn't care who saw. Angela's recovery was slow, but while her body healed, her mind remained sharper than ever. From her hospital bed, she dictated a full sworn statement. Rutherford arranged for it to be notarized, witnessed, and filed under protective seal in 3 separate districts. That single document would later be known as the Kimura Declaration. Meanwhile, I received word from one of the journalists who had received the file. Her name was Lillian Reeves, war correspondent. Backbone of steel. "I believe you," she said over the payphone, "and I want to run it. But my editor won't touch it. Said he got a visit. From men in black suits." "Do it anyway," I said. "I will," she promised. "But we need more than paper. We need voices." So we gave them ours. Rutherford organized a town hall in his home district in Oregon. Not in D.C., too corrupt. Too watched. This would be grassroots. Raw. Angela insisted on attending bandages and all. She walked onto that stage like a soldier. And when she spoke, when she laid bare how she'd been silenced, struck, nearly killed, the crowd didn't blink. They stood, applauded, cried, and then I spoke. I didn't sign up to be a hero, I told them. But I did swear an oath to protect this country from enemies, foreign and domestic. I just never imagined they'd be wearing the same uniform. The crowd roared. But back in D.C., Carver was preparing his final play. He knew we were gaining traction. So he ordered the commission to be disbanded, classified the hearing transcripts, declared all evidence inadmissible during wartime, and signed an order for my dishonorable discharge. Angela and I were summoned to Washington one final time. We knew it was a trap, but we went anyway, because sometimes standing in the fire is the only way to be seen. The invitation was hand-delivered by 2 officers in full dress uniform. A final opportunity, it said, to clarify our testimony, to set the record straight in private. Angela read the letter twice, her fingers trembling slightly. "They're not clarifying anything. They're shutting it down." I nodded. "Then we walk into their trap and spring it from the inside." March 29th, 1942. We returned to Washington this time not as whistleblowers hiding in borrowed clothes, but as fire starters bearing the flame of truth. They tried to keep the hearing secret. No press, no public transcript, just a single table in a silent chamber deep in the bowels of a federal building. A courtroom where justice came to suffocate. Rear Admiral Carver was already seated when we arrived, flanked by 2 Pentagon attorneys. The commission's chair, Senator Whitmore, adjusted his glasses with all the enthusiasm of a man forced to attend his own hanging. Angela wore a navy blue suit, plain and pressed. Her sling had been replaced with a brace, but the bandage over her temple, still red and raw, made her look like a soldier freshly pulled from the trenches. I stood beside her, heart pounding, but not from fear, from the weight of everything riding on this moment. Lieutenant Mathers, Senator Whitmore, began. His tone clipped. "This commission is not obligated to entertain further testimony on matters deemed previously reviewed. However, in the interest of national morale, we are allowing you 5 minutes. 5 minutes to rewrite history." I stepped forward. I didn't read from notes. I didn't rehearse. I told the story like I lived it every day. Since that morning, the sky over Pearl turned black. I filed the report. I sounded the alarm, and I was silenced, reassigned, buried. Because if the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just blame the enemy. It would expose us. Angela rose next. Her voice was calm but cut like steel. Rear Admiral Carver received intercepts from our station. He acknowledged receipt, but the alert never went further. He chose silence, and people died. Carver leaned forward. This is hearsay, dangerous, unverified hearsay during wartime. Angela didn't flinch. Then, why try to kill me? Gasps echoed in the chamber. Whitmore raised a brow. Excuse me. Angela's voice rose. 3 attempts. 1 car, 1 break-in, and 1 accidental discharge from a sidearm held by an officer posted outside my hospital room. And not 1 internal investigation. I slammed a folder on the desk. We brought notarized affidavits, eyewitness accounts, surveillance logs, and 6 copies of the file which have already been mailed to regional presses. Silence. Then Carver smirked. You think the American people want to hear that we failed them, that we let Pearl Harbor happen, that our own soldiers died because of a clerical error. Angela stepped closer. No. They want the truth, even if it hurts, because the truth makes us stronger. Lies rot us from the inside. The room went still. Senator Whitmore rubbed his temples. We will deliberate privately, he muttered, motioning for us to leave. As we walked toward the exit, Carver's voice followed us. You'll be forgotten. The papers will never run it. We control the narrative. Angela turned back slowly. No, you don't. Not anymore. Outside the chamber, we found Congressman Rutherford waiting in the hallway. His hands trembled slightly as he took our statements. They're going to bury this hearing, he said. But they can't stop what's already begun. He handed me a small brown package. What is it? I asked. Insurance, he replied. The original reel. Angela's translation. Copies of the Navy's logs signed by Carver. I had a friend inside the review board. Angela opened the envelope and stared at the contents. We leak it. He shook his head. We publish it. 2 days later, the Oregon Daily Sun ran the headline, Pearl Harbor Warning Ignored. Congressional cover-up exposed. By evening, the story was spreading like wildfire picked up by the Chicago Tribune, the Boston Herald, and international press. The dam had cracked. The public response, outrage, mourning, demands for hearings. Carver's name trended nationwide before the term trending even existed. The military responded swiftly. Carver was placed on indefinite administrative leave. A new bipartisan commission was formed this time with public access recorded sessions and full subpoena power. Angela and I were re-subpoenaed, this time in front of America. We stood on that dais no longer fugitives but witnesses, survivors, patriots. As I finished my testimony, cameras flashing and the nation watching, I said one final thing. I love my country. I served it in war, and I serve it now in truth. The greatest threat to freedom is silence. We were never enemies. But we were treated like threats because we remembered who we were sworn to protect. Angela added, We don't expose the cracks to destroy the house. We expose them so we can fix them before the whole thing falls. That night, walking back from the Capitol hand in hand, Angela looked up at the stars. We did it, she whispered. I nodded. We lit a match in the dark, and this time the whole world saw the flame. History doesn't shatter with a bang. It fractures in silence, then crumbles under the weight of undeniable truth. That's exactly what happened to Rear Admiral Jonathan Carver. For years he stood as an immovable pillar of command draped in medals wielding power from the shadows of secure rooms. But when the people saw what lay beneath his polish, the illusion dissolved. Not overnight, but piece by piece. The second commission hearing aired on national radio. For the first time, the nation didn't have to guess what happened before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. They heard it from our voices, from the real Angela risked her life to preserve, from documents that bore Carver's signature, the ones he tried to erase. And when the committee played that intercepted message in Japanese, translated word for word, attack commences at dawn. Pearl is primary. Proceed under silence. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. Even veterans in the audience, men with missing limbs, faces scarred by flame, hung their heads. Some wept. Some clenched their fists. Not in betrayal, but in knowing that someone could have stopped it. The first real crack came when Captain Harris Carver's own adjutant testified. He stood tall, eyes heavy, voice firm. I saw the intercept. I asked Admiral Carver if we were escalating alert status. He told me to burn it, said it was Pacific theater noise. He used that word noise. The room went still. Angela reached for my hand under the table. She didn't squeeze it, just held it. A quiet gesture that said, "They can't bury this anymore." By the end of the week, Carver was no longer an admiral. He resigned under medical advisement, but no one believed that. Reporters waited outside his Virginia estate, but he refused every interview. Angela and I received word through a back channel that he had moved to a private estate in the Catskills. Secluded. Forgotten. For a man who had once commanded fleets, his world had shrunk to silence. But not ours. Our story became a reckoning. The New York Times ran a 3-part exposé titled, "The Warnings We Ignored." Time magazine called us the Voices of December. Angela was invited to speak at Harvard, Columbia, even West Point. I was reinstated honorably and offered a teaching role at the Naval Academy. I turned it down, not out of bitterness, but because I wasn't finished yet. On July 4th, 1942, Angela and I returned to Pearl Harbor for the first time since the attack. We stood on the memorial platform above the USS Arizona, watching oil still bleed from the wreckage beneath. A priest offered prayer. Families left flowers. The wind carried the weight of memory and the ache of might-have-beens. Angela knelt and placed a folded paper crane on the water. "For the ones who never got the truth," she said. I stayed quiet. Words felt too small. But my heart roared with something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. That night, at a small gathering organized by local survivors, I told the story. Not the headlines, not the politics, just the truth of a young officer trying to be heard, of a woman who refused to stay silent, of a government that nearly let it all burn, but most of all of redemption, not just mine, theirs. Because the people chose to listen. They chose to confront the painful truth instead of hiding behind convenient lies. Back in Washington, legislation was introduced, the Duty of Disclosure Act. It mandated independent review of intelligence prior to dismissal by command. It passed with bipartisan support. They even named it after us, the Mathers-Kimura provision. Angela cried when she saw the bill's final print. She never wanted glory, only justice. Carver. He died quietly in late 1943. Heart failure. No funeral. No honors. His family kept it private. But I went anyway, not to gloat, to forgive. Because that's what truth gives you. The strength to let go. I never thought the story would stretch this far. That two voices could echo through the walls of power and shake them loose. But Angela and we just lit the match. It was the people who made it a fire. 1 week after Carver's resignation, I received a letter from a sailor stationed in Midway. It read, "We got the alert this time. Scrambled an hour early. Shot 2 bombers out of the sky before they reached our fuel lines. We read your story. Thank you for saving us. Petty Officer Samuel K." Angela smiled when she read it. "That's it," she said. "What? That's what we were fighting for. They don't build statues for people like us. There are no parades for the quiet defiant. But every time the truth is spoken unflinching, unbought, it leaves a footprint. And those footprints, they outlast marble. I never wanted to be remembered. I only wanted to be heard. After Carver's fall, after the hearings, after the headlines faded into the background noise of a world at war, Angela and I returned to the simplest version of ourselves. We moved to a small farmhouse outside Eugene, Oregon. No guards, no press, just pine tree stars and the occasional call from a young reporter still chasing a story that mattered. Angela taught at the university. History. Intelligence ethics. I worked with veterans, helped them get benefits, fought for their stories to be recorded truthfully in military archives. Some days it felt like pouring water into a desert. But when I looked into the eyes of the ones who'd been forgotten, I remembered why we started. On the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor, after the Commission's ruling, we were invited to speak at the newly commissioned Memorial of the Unheard. It was simple white stone, etched with the names of 312 individuals who had submitted warning signals and red flags, and were silenced. I ran my fingers across Angela's father's name. She didn't speak, just stood beside me, a red hibiscus tucked behind her ear. Later, she spoke to the crowd, her voice steady as a hymn. "We are not here because we shouted loudest. We are here because we refused to stop whispering, even when the world demanded silence." Years passed. The war ended. Germany fell. Japan surrendered. But the battle for truth never did, because silence has a way of creeping back in, wrapped in flags, dressed as protocol. Angela wrote a book, Whispers Before the Storm. It was banned in 3 military academies and made mandatory reading in 7 universities. She smiled when she found out. "Balance," she said. "The country's learning. We never had children. Maybe we were too busy raising the truth. But we did have visitors, students, young officers, journalists from far corners of the country. They came to ask questions, to sit on the porch to sip coffee, while Angela corrected their facts. And I reminded them that real change is never loud. It's persistent. One day, a boy named Lucas, 16, maybe asked the question that cracked me open. "Mr. Mathers, were you ever afraid it was all for nothing?" I looked at him, and I saw every sailor I couldn't save, every burning sky, every lie we scraped away with bloody fingernails and sleepless nights. And I said, "Yes, but we did it anyway." Angela passed first, peacefully in her sleep. The town held a memorial at the school. Veterans and students alike filled the pews. The mayor cried. The university planted a cherry blossom tree in her name, and in her will she left me a single note. "You made it to shore, David. Now tell them how we swam." Love, eh? I kept my promise. 10 years after her passing, I stood before the Naval Historical Society and told the whole story again. But this time I ended it with a challenge. If truth is the first casualty of war, then let memory be its resurrection. Document everything. Question authority. Protect the whistle. Because next time it might be you who sees the storm first. Today, I'm just an old man with a cane, and a collection of declassified documents in the attic. But sometimes I get letters from soldiers who say thank you, from students who say I never knew, from teachers who say we taught your story today. And in those moments I feel Angela beside me again, smiling, quiet, victorious. One final thing. When I die, I don't want flowers or flags. I want copies of the report, the tape, the file that saved lives and broke a system. Bury me with one, and send the rest to schools, because the truth doesn't need a monument. It just needs to be passed on. What began as a whisper in a radio room became a fire that exposed one of the greatest cover-ups in American history. They tried to silence us. They nearly destroyed us. But in the end, truth spoke louder. Angela and I didn't have rank, power, or protection. We had each other. We had the facts. And we had the courage to not let the dead be forgotten. This story isn't just about Pearl Harbor. It's about every voice that gets buried when speaking up is inconvenient. Every truth ignored because it challenges the comfortable. And every person who stands up knowing the cost but does it anyway. The truth doesn't need permission to exist. Silence in the face of wrong is complicity. Courage is not the absence of fear, it's action despite fear. History is not made by the powerful. It's rewritten by those brave enough to challenge them. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful, real stories that were almost lost to silence. Comment below. What would you have done in David's place? Have you ever tried to speak truth and been ignored? Share this video because someone out there needs to know. Even in darkness, one voice can change everything.